when season 8 is going to be terrible or why I think the show is terrible. I actually have high hopes for the final season. Looking at the problems with the different stories just gives us a way to work through what might actually happen at the end. Jon Snow has a lot of problems. He's a walking problem. At the same time, he's awesome. As we saw in that clip there, he has made some bad decisions in the heat of battle. That's just one example of that happening. I suppose that is excusable in that it makes him relatable. I'm sure in your own life you could think of a situation where you had things all planned out and you were going to do it a certain way, and then you get caught up in the emotion of it all. And I'm sure on some level, for some viewers, this really kind of makes him a better character. The first big problem that Jon has as far as this series is concerned, though, is that he is a hero. We like him. He's got a tough story. He turned things around. But that also makes him kind of an archetypal hero character that we've seen before. He was born thinking he was a bastard. This causes him to go on this journey. He leaves home, becomes a member of the Night's Watch. His mentor growing up, Ned Stark, who he thinks is his father, happens to die. The mentor that he gets at the Wall, J.R. Mormont, ends up dying. In the process of that, he gets himself a magical sword. None of these things come out as things you haven't seen before. The reason why this is such a big problem is because we don't expect this to have the stereotypical fantasy ending of the hero triumphing over evil and winning and sitting on the Iron Throne at the end to rule his kingdom with his bride by his side. It's just not what we're expecting to have happen. His story just hits that hero character a little bit too close. He's had to overcome adversity. He had to make some tough decisions and do what he knew was right. And he even got killed only to be resurrected as a result of that. How can you not like this guy? At the same time, we don't want to see him win. We don't think that he'll win because we've been watching the story and we don't think that's how it's going to go. I think it's important to say, though, you hear people say a lot, like, it's not going to have a Disney ending. There's a reason why Disney movies have the Disney ending. There's a reason why so many stories are a hero's journey story. It works. It's a compelling tale to tell. So if you're sitting there thinking, well, I think it would be great if Jon Snow was on the Iron Throne at the end of the story and Daenerys was by his side, and I'm not saying that that's a stupid thing to want. I'm just saying that I don't think that's what's going to happen. Some of the other problems that I see with Jon's story is that, one, he doesn't really seem like he would be a good leader. To paraphrase George R.R. Martin, just because someone is a good person doesn't make them a good leader. And we've kind of seen that in this world. Most of the people that we've seen in this world who are good at playing the Game of Thrones also happen to be terrible people. Tywin Lannister, Peter Baelish, Cersei's doing a pretty good job of it right now. You get the idea. Jon kind of fashions himself after Ned Stark. He tries to be an honorable man. He tries to do the right thing. And let's just remember what happened to Ned Stark in this world. For a more recent example, in season 7, when they were in the dragon pit, Cersei said she would commit her troops. And of course, she may have been lying at that point too, but she said she would as long as Jon wouldn't back either queen in the war that came after the War for the Dawn. And all Jon had to do was just tell a little lie. Instead, he decided to tell her the truth, and as we all saw, things broke down. So I think it's safe to say that if things stayed the way that they are, Jon isn't really cut out to be a leader in the world that we know. Another problem with that is that he probably wouldn't want to be one either. You could actually totally see Jon saying no if the throne was offered to him at the end. But I mean, we've all seen the story of the reluctant hero too, so I don't think that exactly evens things out. But it is worth noting that he probably wouldn't want to rule, and if there was any way to get out of it, he would probably take that option instead. Another big problem with Jon is that he has been reanimated or resurrected, or he was dead and now he's alive. There are some practical problems related to that. Would the people accept someone who's reanimated as a leader? What if the magic all disappears? Will he still be alive? Things like that. But why I bring this up as a problem with the story is because we've already seen that happen. Whether you saw it on the show or you read it in the books, when Jon died the first time, it was pretty... Unless someone told you about it, you weren't really expecting it. It was a shocker. Of course, there were a few people who had already come back from the dead, so at that point in the story, you're no longer thinking like he's for sure dead. But yeah, we sort of went through that once, and would it really have the same effect again? I mean, it would. It would be sad if he died, but it just doesn't seem like the big twist in the show is that Jon's going to die for real. Since he's still dead in the books, we don't know a whole lot about it. The show doesn't really go into the details very deeply. I believe it in the books, where he has a connection with Ghost, like an actual Worgen connection. I've always assumed that he would go into Ghost and then he'll come back. He'll probably still be brought back by Melisandre, but we'll know a little bit more about the details of his coming back. Because Jon in the show doesn't seem a whole lot different than he did before he died. Like the other ones that we've seen come back in the books, like Beric and then Lady Stoneheart, they're clearly changed. And that's a theme that's always been running through the story, that you have to pay a price. You lose something in order for that to happen. Khal Drogo was a good example of that. I was under the impression that Jon in the show is exactly the same, but the other day I was listening to a podcast where Brian Cogman was being interviewed, and he actually said that Kit Harington plays Jon different now. Like, there's a noticeable difference, at least that Brian Cogman, who is a writer turned executive producer on the show, as far as he's concerned, he sees the difference in Jon. I don't think it's very clear. I don't think they've gone out of their way to make that clear to us that somehow Jon has been changed by the experience. George R. R. Martin had mentioned that Beric was sort of like a Firewhite, and that he loses something every time he comes back. But he's a Firewhite in the sense that he doesn't have blood moving through his veins. Like, he's not really alive, not in the sense that everyone else is. Catelyn is definitely not the same as she was as Lady Stoneheart. Jon may end up being a different case, because if he goes into Ghost, then maybe he won't lose as much of himself or whatever, but we just don't know about that. And it was said that Beric was foreshadowing for Jon that being a Firewhite, but it doesn't mean that he will be exactly the same. It just meant that we see people brought back to life in this world, so we know that it's possible that Jon could come back too. So in relation to him being able to, say, father a child with Daenerys or anything like that, I think that it's a pretty good guess that he can. But as far as the story goes, him dying a second time, it just isn't as exciting as someone else dying. And since we're on the topic of Daenerys, it should be said that he has a problem as far as his new love affair is concerned. And I think it should be classified as a love affair. I think there's a real connection that they have. I don't think it's some BS political Jon theory kind of. I think that their relationship will be legit. They'll have to deal with the fact that they are related and that he is not who he thought he was. But it's interesting because we talk about the conflict in characters. His conflict was always his identity. That shifted once he became the spokesperson for the war against the Night King and the White Walkers. That became his identity. He was the one who needed to rally the troops. And then he met the Dragon Queen, and now he is, in fact, in love. I think that's set up to be a big part of his identity now, is that he found this person, but it's complicated. Like I said in her video, I think it'll just play itself out, though. I think that they have bigger things to worry about. In the first couple of episodes, he'll find out who his parents were, who he actually is. But I don't think that that will become his identity. Like, I don't think that Aegon Targaryen will be born once he finds this out. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, he wouldn't want to be a ruler if given the opportunity, but he will have to come to terms with that. He will have to work it out with his aunt, how things move forward with their relationship. His claim to the throne is better than hers, and all of that other stuff that we all know is going to be in the forefront of their conversations for at least a couple episodes. I also mentioned in that other video, I think if it comes down to her being with child, there's no way that he's going to allow another bastard to be brought into the world, so he's going to have to work it out in his head until he can justify it as the honorable thing to do, and it's just going to work itself out. All of these things, of course, fit into the last and the biggest problem in my mind. Jon is not a great leader. He's not the right kind of guy for this story as far as being a leader. He's way too on the nose as being a hero character. His story is just a hero story. He has a tendency to make bad decisions in the heat of the battle. He doesn't want to lead. And of course, he did die and came back to life, which means that his death isn't that exciting. So the final problem turns out to be, what do we do with Jon Snow at the end of this story? There are a lot of different theories, which I guess I'll touch on a bit, but I don't want to go down any of those roads because I don't think ultimately they're going to happen. One theory that's out there amongst book readers is that Jon is the target of the Night King, and the reason that is the case is because he needs Jon to take his place. I mean, that's the really simplified version of it, but he doesn't want to kill Jon. He doesn't want to be the Night King anymore, and he wants Jon to take his place, and there's a fairly decent theory that makes sense if you follow it all the way through. Another theory is that the magic will have to end at the end of the story. This would likely, I'll get into this more in my Problems with Bran video that'll come out after this one, but this would probably involve Bran doing something inside the Weirwood network that shuts the whole thing down. Again, this is very simple telling of the theory that kind of makes sense if you read it all the way out. In that situation, is Jon just brought back? Is he alive because of magic? Does Jon then die whenever the magic's gone? Some people seem to think that that's the case. But I mean, if he's not going to be the big exciting death in the season, and if he's not going to sit on the throne and rule as the king, what do we do with him? Does he just jump on a dragon? Does he just jump on Rhaegar at the end and fly off into the sunset and agree never to come back? I've heard people say something along that lines, but it's just kind of hard to figure out, isn't it? The one thing that I can say that, as I've been looking at all these different stories, there's an underlying idea that there's going to have to be a battle with the Night King and the White Walkers. That isn't the final end of the story.